So we've had a little look at precedent down in Cromarty, and then we've looked at wall preparation and packing out, galleting or cherry cocking the surface. And this is a wall that I've recently built with a hydraulic hot lime mortar. And what I want to look at now is how to finish this wall. And I've chosen, instead of completely harling it, I'm going to sneck harl it. And we've had a look at what sneck harl means down in Cromarty. So in other words, the high points of the stone will grin through, and all the other areas, all the cherry cocks, will be covered. And in this case, I'm going to have a little go at ruling out. You can see from the hydraulic hot lime mortar that I've used that it's quite white. And when I think about it, I'd actually like to tone that down a little bit. So in this mortar, in the mixer, what I've done is I've added some pigments. And you can see that it's a full tone darker than the mortar that the wall is built with. And the way that I've achieved that is to add some pigments. And what I've done is I've used raw umber, that's the greater part of the pigment. I've used yellow ochre, that's the medium volume of pigments. But I've also used a tiny bit of Venetian red as well. Of course, the other thing that dictates the tonal values of your mortar will be the sands that you use. So I can't give you exactly how much pigments to use. But you'll have to experiment with that, and that experimentation is a three-part process. It involves you, it involves your client, and it involves your architect. And it also, of course, involves a sample panel. So let's now talk about how to prepare the wall prior to getting the mortar on there. You can see that on the wall I've got some covers, and last night I damped the wall down and I gave it a really, really good soak. And I want the wall to be damp, but I don't want it to be glossy. So I just thought I'd give you a sense of what I mean by really good soak. And what I actually mean by glossy. So you can see the top half of that wall has got the shine, the gloss of the water from it. Now I wouldn't dream of pointing directly on top of that. So this is what I did last night, and I soaked that wall for pretty much half an hour actually. I checked the weather forecast, and I knew it wasn't going to be frosty, but there was a danger that we'd get more rain in the night, and hence the reason that I've covered it with those heavy-duty tarpaulins. So that's the sort of preparation you'd need to make. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my cover off the far wall, and that's the wall that we're going to be looking at this morning in terms of the sneck harling and the ruling out. Okay, so we've uncovered the wall, and you can see this dark Taradale sandstone. This is a piece of that same Taradale sandstone, and you can see the difference in tonal values because this piece of sandstone has been in the workshop, and it's been in the workshop for several weeks, so it's completely dry. And what I'm looking for is a nicely, really damp wall, and I can just adjust this at the point of delivery if I want to. I could give it a very light spray, but I won't actually know that until I start applying the lime mortar. So when I say a really light spray, really it is just that at this stage. Let me say again, this has already been soaked overnight. So I want to say just something else about the mortar. This was a hydraulic hot lime mortar. In other words, the quicklime had hydraulic properties. There's a lot of confusion about what a hot lime mortar is, and most people just assume that a hot lime mortar is made from a high calcium quicklime. That certainly isn't true in Scotland. because so many of our limestones were hydraulic. And what I've done is I've mixed the mortar 3 days ago actually, and that's when I added the pigments, and I've left it sitting in a 1-ton bag just so that it cools off and any of the finer particles go through the slaking process. So that's what I mean by a hydraulic hot lime mortar. There's nothing else added to that, it's a naturally hydraulic hot lime mortar. So when I mix this hydraulic hot lime mortar, I mixed it at a rate of 3 parts of coarse sand to 1 part of the quicklime. So it's giving me something like a 2-to-1 mix, so it's very fatty. It's really nice to use actually. And you can see that it is ever so slightly on the wet side. Remember, we're not building with this, we're finishing. All the wall preparation has been done with the cherry cocks or gallets. This is just the finishing coat. And we're trying to produce a sneck-harl finish, so it needs to be quite liquid when it goes on. So I'm applying it really liberally. And what's really important about this is you don't play around with it too much and over trowel it, because the material itself is thixotropic, so it'll separate out. So just get it on at this stage, not being too fussy at all. When I was actually working in the field, I was called spruce because I was so messy. Going over the cherry cocks, going over the pinnings. Brave about this and not be too precious about the stone. It's just the high points of the stone we want to grin through. You sort of get the feel for it. So you'll start out timidly and then you'll get braver. So what I'm looking for is a torn surface, and I really like these old saw blades. So I'm evening it out, but I'm not ending up with an over-troweled surface. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw sand into the surface of that. Now, we don't have to do this. Not everyone would admire this, but I quite like the fact that we end up with a really nice texture and something which is comfortable in cover, comfortable in colour. The thing about this is that if you're patching up sneck-harl, this is a really neat way of sweetening the old to the new. You want to make sure that you don't go right to the edge of where you're working, otherwise you'll end up with a joint line. And while that's still wet, I now just take this brush and I just tap and what I'm also doing is I'm closing in that top edge so that any water that were to run down the wall face wouldn't go into the closed joint. This dash is the same sand that I made the mortar with. Notice that when I'm tapping that in, I'm using that end of the brush, not the flat of the brush. What you'll find is if you use the flat of the brush, you'll get little lines in this. And you'll also notice that you want to try and keep the brush clean, which is why I wear the wets for working in. So remember, don't over trowel it, make sure you just get it in there. And we'll press it in and tear it off with the saw blade. I thought was it really important that this was sneg carved, because Historic Environment Scotland, who are the funders of my PhD, and I collaborated to produce a technical paper looking at traditional Scots Lime Pointing. And this is such a feature within Scotland. And I accept that some people feel uncomfortable about it, but I also felt that, well, the reality is I also felt that I should practice what I preach. So now we come to the ruling out. Ruling out is incredibly common, certainly throughout the 19th century. And my suspicion is that it was more common in earlier periods than we give it credit for. So if one looks at somewhere like New Hale's House, 1680s-ish, with extension from 1720, all of New Hales is ruled out. And the same is true for Fleur's Castle. And what I'm looking to try and do is create a nice even rule. Now don't get too worried if at this stage it isn't as even as you'd like, because we can always go back over it. So this looks clumsy. So what we'll do there is just edit that out. And go back over it. Slightly more gentle. It's better. So this was so common in the 19th century, and sometimes these lines were filled in afterwards with whitewash or white lead, and then on occasion you'll see it on farm buildings, even on some houses, where not much attention has been paid to actually keeping the ruling out particularly straight. It really is very, very informal. I actually call it 2 points pointing, like that. But we'll be a bit more formal than that. So, we've completed the top half, but I want to just say something about continuity. It's really important that everything is well planned when you're doing this, so that you don't end up with joint lines. So the potential here on a big elevation is that we'd end up with a joint line. And by a joint line, I mean you can see where the work before 10 o'clock and the work after 10 o'clock is slightly different. There is a line across there. And joint lines are the bane of all our lives these days because of modern scaffolds. And what I've done here is I've scraped back the mortar that I applied before T-rate, and then I've gone back over it again. I'm going to have to work really hard to make sure that that's edited out and really sweetened in. Again, get it roughed on. Don't take too much time about this at this stage. And remember also that once this is all firmed up, we'll be going back over it again and doing a bit of cleaning up. I absolutely get that many of you will feel that you're losing your precious stone. But the notion that stone, particularly rubble stone like this, is something to be valued is a relatively recent thing. In the past, stone is just something that everyday people use to build with. And all that separates stone from, say, clay or straw is the time of decay. In other words, stone is the pre-industrial equivalent of the concrete block. It's something that's fine, but everybody recognises should be covered. The true colours of architecture aren't natural stone. They're actually whatever social, political or financial conditions prevailing at any given time allow. In other words, don't be too fussy. You need to be fussy about the preparation, making sure that it's solid, making sure that the joints don't leak, and you need to be really careful about your aftercare and your pre-work damping down. But at this stage, try and be carefree, and there's a difference between carefree and careless. Now, the other thing that I want to very quickly look at here is how to go about doing this process but leaving out the sand. I am actually going to sand it over, but I just wanted you to see how you could do this and not get the sandy finish. Remembering, once again, that we're going to have a massive clean-up once all this is done. So it won't look quite so foreign as it is at the moment. So we've got our mortar all nicely flushed out. We've got a nice torn surface on it. The other thing about the sand, of course, is that it stops your brush getting quite so sticky. But as you can see, with lots of cleaning, you can actually get around that, i.e. cleaning the brush. Really important that you're using that tip of the brush and not the flat of the brush. If you find that the brush is sticky, get yourself a little drop of water and just not only clean your brush but damp it, and you'll find that it won't pull quite as much while you're doing it. I also find that if you're working this in, if you try really hard to sort of circulate your movements, that helps produce a slightly more naturalistic thrown look. And I should say something about that, because remember that this is what we're trying to produce. We're trying to produce something that has the appearance of being thrown. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have thrown this, but it does mean that you end up with quite a big cleaning operation. And this process of just using the brush just does help a little bit. So that's just giving you an indication of how you would go about this if you didn't want to throw the sand at it. But when I look at this, what I see here is that that little stone highlight there is a recessed highlight and not a high highlight, if you see what I mean. And actually, I think that we get rid of that. We're brave about it and we lose it. We're brave about it and we lose it. We're brave about it and we're brave about it, and we are brave about it just there as well. Maybe a spot in there. It's surprising how few stone highlights that you need to give the appearance of a snake-carved wall. Now, the other thing I would say about this brush technique, this is something you can use when you're fully harling a building, particularly in urban areas, on things like chimney stacks where it's really difficult to throw because of the problems with the harl going everywhere and trying to protect roof structures. Slates, leadwork and things like that. It just minimises mess. So at this stage, that is absolutely fine. Remember, I am going to go back over this again in a little while, and you'll see what that entails. But, of course, I've paid a lot of attention to that line there, and we've pretty much lost where the top half met the bottom half before tea break. I'm now going to throw the sand into that. Attention to that area where the joint was. Just using the tip of the brush. Okay, so we're going to carry on with the ruling out. But I just want to say a little bit about the perpendicular lines as well. So, lots of projects have the perpendicular lines as well as the horizontal. I've chosen to apply just the horizontal on this, partly out of preference and partly because I think that the horizontal lines just give it a greater mass, and for a small wall I think it's going to be incredibly confusing having lots and lots of lines in it. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you couldn't do that, it just means to say that I've chosen not to. And in a second I'm going to show you how I like to rule in the perpendicular lines as well. And once we've got those perpendicular lines run in, you get a sense of what they might look like. So I like to just keep it back from the edge. So start really lightly and then make it more distinct. And then as it comes to that lower horizontal line, just suggest it in there. The reason I'm saying that is that it often looks clumsy with the bit of curve that you get if you go right into that joint. So that was just to give you an idea of it, and I'm just going to take that out. And already I can sense that this is firming up because of the feebly hydraulic component. If this were incredibly formal over large elevations, what I would have done is I would have made myself a gauge lat so that all the different elevations would tie in with each other. So I wouldn't necessarily use the level, I'd use the lath. I'd rely on the lath rather than the level. So the final point I want to make here is that when you're ruling out semi-formally, which is how I describe this, try and make sure that the spaces between the ruling out are larger at the bottom than they are at the top. So, we did the sneck harling yesterday and we ruled it out. But one of the things I just wanted to talk briefly about was protecting the work after it's done. Now I'm fortunate here because I've got a good projection on the coping stone and there's the big boulder down there. So I can keep this heavy tarpaulin clear of the wall. So you need to think very carefully about your weather conditions. Ideally, you'd have no frost, but it would be a damp atmosphere and you wouldn't have to put a cover on it on your first one, maybe 2 nights. That way, the tarpaulin won't flap against your sneck harl and push it back. So just have a think about that, about looking at your weather forecast before you start your work. In a week or so's time, we're going to come back to this and we're going to dust a lot of this sand off so that the sneck harl won't be bright white, it'll have a nice sandy colour. But we'll look at that next time. So we have the cover off the wall here, and what I've done is I've now brushed a lot of the sand off the stones, but I've also taken quite a bit of the sand, the loose sand, off the sneck harl. And you'll also notice that on this elevation I've taken a little block of slate in this case and I've just run over the surface incredibly lightly and flattened the surface of the harl and taken off any high points. And I'm taking particular care where it meets the cope. Just a glance over the surface. So it's dust off the stones, dust off any loose sand from the harl, and then glance over the top with a little piece of wood or a little piece of slate and flatten it back. Now the flattening back is very much an optional extra if you want, and it's something that you would need to agree with your architect and your client. I like doing it as well because it just pushes it back and firms it back into the wall again. Let's talk about covering up work. One of the very few advantages of climate change is that winter working is becoming much more accessible. But we still have to cover up, and we have to cover up for 2 reasons. 1, because of temperature, and 2, because of rainfall. Yesterday, when I was working on this wall face, it was 13 degrees. It's now December. Those are the absolutely perfect conditions in which to work because I've got a high relative humidity, but I've also got a high temperature. My wall face had been soaked several days before, so it had retained all that moisture in it, and we discussed this earlier on. So, as I say, the absolutely perfect conditions in which to work. We're going to take these covers off, but I want to say something about them. So these are really thick, heavy-duty canvas tarpaulins. Now you could use Hessian, but if you're using Hessian, you need to pick a grade of Hessian that's the really thick, heavy duty one, not the really open textured Hessian. And the closed textured Hessian will give you protection from rain, but it will also help to insulate your wall. And again, you can see the thickness of this canvas tarpaulin. Let me stress again, this is to protect it from rain and to control my temperature during winter months. So we've got the covers off, and what I'm hoping you can see is the sandiness and freshness of my Sneckhardt finish and what it looks like with the dusting down. If you recall, this is a wall that actually we were going to harl, and for the purposes of demonstration we've Sneckhardt it and ruled it out. And on this elevation I wanted to try and leave a bit more of the stone grinning through. But before we get to that, I want to show you how I've achieved this by dusting some of the sand off. So I have two brushes. I have a soft brush and I have a firm brush. The firm brush I use to pat the sand into the Sneckhardt. I'm going to use this firm brush in the first stage of getting rid of the excess sand from the Sneckhardt finish. So let me show you how I go about that. And you'll be able to see the sand just coming off as I start the tapping process. So this is the day after it was applied, and you can see that quite a lot of that sand is beginning to come off, and where I've got the high points of the stone, I can give that a little brush, but you need to be careful about that at this stage, because remember our hydraulic hot lime mortar is firm but not totally solid. And again, I'm using the tip of the brush, that section there, you can see how it's worn, to give us a really nice thrown texture without the lines of the brush going through it. So by tapping on the high point of the stone, you can see the stone is really starting to grin through. Again, you can see how the stone is beginning to grin through. Again, and right in the middle of that stone, I can afford just to brush. And as I get to my mortar, I return to tapping it in again. Again, you can see the high point of the stone now beginning to be exposed. Again, so we're pushing the sand into the mortar, we're pushing the mortar back, and we're beginning to explore exposing the stone. And you're going to have to produce sample panels and sign this off between yourselves and your architect and your client. And of course, I've kept a really close eye on the weather, and although it was mild yesterday and in the evening wet, we've got nice blue skies, so the temperature is going to drop overnight. So I'm going to put those covers back on again, and this time I'm covering not because of the rainfall but because of the temperature. So with this wall, this was built with small stones for the greater part, with the odd big stone. So where we've got the odd big stone, we can be brave about cleaning that off. But I have lost quite a lot of the small stones, and that's absolutely fine. Remember, it was going to be a wall that was going to be harled, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I've chosen to Sneckhardt it. But where you've got bigger blocks of stone, you should be able to manage to expose more of those bits of bare masonry. Here's a block of sandstone on the corner, that Taradale sandstone, so we can clean that right off. So the second stage of this process will be to take the softer brush and begin to tease the loose sand off the Sneckhardt. Now, this is the day after that I've applied this, and the reality is that it's a little bit too soon to go through this process. However, I'm going to give it a little try, and it'll give you a sense of how I would go about it. So again, very soft fine brush, and I begin to just tease away at the sand off the stone and off the sneck hull. Now you don't want to go on to this too early, because obviously you'll end up spoiling a texture. But you can see how, if you're very careful, you can start to lose some of that loose sand from both the stone and from the sneck hull. Let me stress again, under normal circumstances I would have left this for a couple of more days. So I've managed to give these stones a little bit of a clean up, and you can see how the high spots are grinning through, much more so than on our first elevation. But the price we've paid for that is the wall is less flush, but that's fine. It's to demonstrate a point. And of course, in a couple of days' time, when the mortar is firmed up, I'll go quickly back over again the high points of the stone, and I'll get more of that sand and a little bit more of the mortar off, and that will be it. But that's a very, very quick process. On this elevation, you'll recall that once I'd applied my mortar, I then created a flush surface and a torn surface using the saw blade. And that's a surface I'm very comfortable with. But on this elevation, I was keen that you saw the method I use for leaving more of the stone exposed. So I applied my mortar in exactly the same way, but instead of using the saw blade to create an absolutely flush surface, I used the edge of the trowel, and I ripped the surface with the edge of the trowel and then threw the sand onto it and pushed that in with the brush in exactly the same way as I did on our first elevation. So the only difference is that I'm creating the torn surface with the edge of the trowel and not the saw blade. Therefore, I can expose more of the stone. So as I keep stressing, this wall was built to take hull. So the intervals between the stones on this corner, big, small, big, and the intervals between the stones on this corner, big, huge, medium, medium, small, don't necessarily relate to the joint lines. And I don't think that in these circumstances we can be too fussy about whether this joint relates to this joint and whether this joint perfectly matches the ruling out around this corner. And in some places, particularly in the middle of the wall here, what I've ended up with are a couple of joint lines ruled in which actually don't relate to this stone or to these stones at all. And all we're trying to do is to break up some of this neck hull and add a sort of sense of formal horizontality to the whole block of masonry. So you can see here, this joint line rules down through here, through here, through here, right to the end. But this joint line has no relationship to the stone there, and it has no relationship to the stones down here, because this joint line is on the corner and then fades away, but this joint line respects the bedding plane of that stone there. In other words, just try and get as many as you sensibly can lines ruled in. So we have one wall that's sneck hulled, flushed out with a saw blade, cleaned down with a soft brush, and then pressed back. And at the moment we've got this wall which is less flush, more stone showing. It's been sneck hulled and ruled out, but you can see the change in texture. This hasn't been pressed back at all, and that's a perfectly valid finish. But I want to just go through the pressing back process again, so you can see how that will be done. Because this has only just been sneck-harled, whereas this wall was fully firmed up and I was able to take off the high points, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm pressing it in rather than knocking off the high points. And already you can see how that just takes out some of the shadow lines of the sneck-harl. It's purely an aesthetic decision, and there's no precedent for this at all. It's entirely a contemporary aesthetic decision. And again, let me stress that in about a week's time I'll have another go at cleaning down some of those stones, and I might even clean off some of the old mortar from the recycled blocks of sandstone, so we see even more of the stone grinning through. I want to stress again that none of these tasks take a long time. It's all very quick. The secret is in just managing your project so that it runs really sweetly and everyone knows what they're doing. I've actually found that when I was working as a contractor, that people had a designated task. There'd be the man or woman who applied the sneck-harl, the person who threw the sand, possibly the person that used the brush, and you can have the person who takes responsibility for pressing it back. And that is a really useful means on a large elevation of making sure that you have continuity throughout the job. So we've talked about the covers, we've talked about the environment that we've created to facilitate curing and carbonation. We've talked about how you can be adventurous with the ruling out, and we've talked about pushing the sand into the mortar and then dusting it off again with the soft brush. So we're almost there with this. And I just want to say a final word about the speed in which we can undertake this process. So this dusting down at this stage has taken me about 5 minutes. Actually applying the sneck-harl and the ruling out for this whole small elevation took about an hour and a half. So we can also get a sense that it's actually a very economic way of going about finishing a wall. So don't be afraid of this. Be brave about covering up the stone. You can be more flexible about the extent of stone that grins through by not using the saw blade, but using the edge of the trowel to keep a torn surface, and also being adventurous when you're doing the ruling out. I hope you've enjoyed seeing how this work proceeds, and the next time we do something like this, we'll look at full harl and lime wash.